Up to this point, we've focused on a single historical narrative, tracing the big history of the Roman Empire from its beginning after the death of Julius Caesar to the point we are now at the end of the Severan dynasty and the beginning of what will come to be called the crisis of the 3rd century, arguably one of the darkest times in Roman history. But before we dive into that depressing and difficult era, I want to give a proper goodbye to a Roman senator who's been a key source throughout this entire podcast. His name is Cassius Dio. Cassius Dio wrote a long, epic history of Rome and its empire up to his day. He died right before the crisis of the 3rd century, and yet it seems like he saw it coming. Today we are going to look at that warning. What solutions did the Senator Cassius Dio offer? And would these reforms have prevented the 50-year crisis that followed after he died? Let's get into Cassius Dio's final warning on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 71. Could one senator have saved the Roman Empire? Before we get started, I just want to plug again the talk that I'm giving for Smithsonian Associates. That's the group that runs the programming for the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Now, the good news is this talk is a virtual talk, so you don't have to go to Washington, D.C. to catch it. The talk I'm giving is called After Caesar, the Last Years of the Roman Republic. It'll be Tuesday, February 11th, starting at 6:45 p.m. Just look for that title, After Caesar, the Last Years of the Roman Republic. Look for my name, Colin Elliott, on the Smithsonian website. You'll be able to pick up your tickets that way. There's a Q&A period after the lecture. I hope that you'll join me for that. And of course, as always, there is this podcast and my YouTube channel, in which I'm doing a series on the origins of Rome, which you can check out as well. That for free, of course, on YouTube. Just look up my name or my handle on YouTube at Prof. CPE, and you can catch those lectures there. And I'll just say briefly, if you like this podcast and you haven't yet done so, please like the podcast, leave a comment to let me know that you're enjoying it, subscribe to the podcast, and it especially helps if you would leave a review and rate the podcast on whatever app you're using to listen to it. All right, that's plenty of preamble. Let's get to today's episode. Cassius Dio. We have been indirectly talking about him for almost 70 episodes straight. He has been a crucial source for understanding the Pax Romana and the period just after. And so you already know that he was a Roman senator who entered the Senate right around the same time as the Emperor Commodus. In fact, he was born just a few years ahead of Commodus in AD 155 in Nicaea in the province of Bithynia. So Cassius Dio was, of course, a Roman, but he also had those Greek roots that came from being born in Asia Minor. And indeed, he wrote in Greek. He was, of course, well-educated, a man who understood rhetoric and philosophy and Roman history. He was also a successful politician in an age in which it was very difficult to survive under both Commodus and then the Severans. We saw in recent episodes how tumultuous this period was, and yet Cassius Dio was a senator. He rose through the ranks holding a variety of political offices, including the consulship, once under Septimius Severus in 205 AD, and then again with Severus Alexander in AD 229. He also served governorships in North Africa, Dalmatia, and Pannonia, those last two being in Central Europe. Those were provinces subject at times to invasions and other sensitive foreign policy matters. So Cassius Dio was obviously well trusted by those emperors. He had military experience serving under Septimius Severus at opposite ends of the empire. He fought in Parthia in the east, and he also fought in Britain in the northwest of the empire. Now again, if you've been listening to the podcast, you know that he wrote the Roman history, an extensive history of Rome from its legendary founding all the way until his last days, right around the year AD 229 or AD 30. There are 80 books in Cassius Dio's Roman history. Many of them are completely lost or are only fragmentary. the ones that survive in summaries and paraphrases that were put together in the Middle Ages. And Cassius Dio's Roman history is a vital, crucial source. He covers periods for which we don't always have other sources, and that makes his perspective quite valuable. It's also really interesting to have the perspective of a senator who lived through events about which he writes. So his history of the reigns of Commodus through the end of the Severan dynasty are especially valuable. Now, we're obviously not going to read huge chunks of that massive Roman history, but I want to focus on one small part of it. The part I want to focus on is in Book 52, and that includes parts of the reign of Augustus, which of course would be 2 centuries before Cassius Dio was writing. In that book, however, Cassius Dio creates a debate between 2 of Augustus's most influential advisors, Agrippa and Maecenas. And the reason this 200-year-old debate is important is because it's totally fictitious. What Cassius Dio does is he puts his own arguments for what the emperors of his day ought to do in this debate. So it's pretty fascinating. A speech which we know is fictitious is nevertheless an excellent source because it tells us what the author of the speech, Cassius Dio, believed should be done in his own day. Agrippa, Augustus's right-hand man, argues for a more democratic form of government, where Rome is a kind of city-state among an empire of city-states. The Senate rules, and there is no need for a strong central figure. Maecenas disagrees and lays out what a good emperor would look like, and we're sort of meant to see in Cassius Dio's constructed debate here that ultimately imperial rule is good when the emperor is good. And so what Cassius Dio does is he suggests that there is a precedent that the emperors of his day could look back to and follow if they wanted to be good emperors like Augustus. It's a sly move. So first I want to go ahead and lay out some of his ideas for reform, ideas that he thinks could save the Roman Empire, and then we'll talk about the extent to which maybe some of these might have worked. And I want to focus on 5 areas: military reforms, taxation and provincial administration, public expenditures, economic policy, the role of the Senate, and then lastly, religion, or what we might also call ruler cult, that is, emperor worship. So let's go ahead and look at those 5 areas. Now, I'm not going to quote at huge length from the speech, but I do want to actually read some portions of it. Let's start out with what Cassius Dio says about the role of the military. He says, quote, "A standing army should be supported. The reason for a standing army is this: far removed as we are from the frontiers of the empire, with enemies living near our borders on every side, we are no longer able at critical times to depend upon expeditionary forces. And if, on the other hand, we permit all the men of military age to have arms and to practice warfare, they will always be the source of seditions and civil wars. The hardiest of them and those most in need of a livelihood should be enlisted as soldiers and given a military training, for they will fight better if they devote their time to this one business, and the rest will find it easier to carry on their farming and seafaring and the other pursuits appropriate to peace, if they're not compelled to take part in military expeditions, but have others to act as their defenders. Thus, the most active and vigorous element of the population, which is generally obliged to gain its livelihood by brigandage, will support itself without molesting others, while all the rest will live without incurring dangers." That's chapter 27 of Cassius Dio's book 52. And you can already tell here, this is ostensibly Maecenas in the Augustan age, but he is talking about problems that Cassius Dio and his audience knew all too well. Too many soldiers that are engaging in crimes against the empire, roving bands of brigands, robbing and pillaging Roman cities. Cassius Dio says, hey, here is a solution to that. We have a standing army in which we funnel and train the best fighters, and we indoctrinate them in an ideology that supports a single emperor. They will be professional soldiers under one commander-in-chief. And what they will do is police the frontiers of the empire, and they will protect the borders. What we don't want, Cassius Dio says, is just raising up a bunch of soldiers to go fight foreign adventures and then turn them loose again on the population when they're done. They'll have weapons and training and nothing to do. They won't have families or lands to call their own, and so, of course, they will turn into criminals, brigands, and gangs. And in the absolute worst case scenario, they will, quote, be the source of seditions and civil wars. That is exactly what Cassius Dio had seen. And unfortunately for the Romans, Cassius Dio's words would be prophetic. Had the Romans implemented this policy, supporting a military that was of reasonable size, not engaging in foreign adventurism, and simply defending their borders, I have to think that would have made a difference. The civil wars that would follow in the crisis of the 3rd century, and indeed the civil wars that Cassius Dio himself had experienced, bankrupted the Roman state, forced debasement of the currency, which wrecked the economy even further. It increased the militarization of society, such that there were men all over the Roman Empire who had weapons and training and little else to do. They didn't have the skills of farming and seafaring and trade. The real skills they had were military skills, which of course translated well to violent crime, armed robberies, piracy, and those sorts of chaos-promoting activities. Now, Cassius Dio is in no way suggesting that Rome give up the empire. He's not a pacifist, obviously, but he sees a standing army that is defense-oriented, preserving a stable and secure state. And in the context of his age, I don't think he was wrong to call for that. Well, as Maecenas in his speech goes on, he then turns to taxation and matters in the provinces. This is what he says, quote, if provincials are subjected to no further abuses and are indeed convinced that all these contributions of theirs will make for their own security and for their fearless enjoyment of the rest of their property, and that again the large part of their contributions will be received by none but themselves, then they will be exceedingly grateful to you, since they will be giving but a slight portion of the abundance from which they derive the benefit without having to submit to abuses. Especially will this be true if they see that you live temperately and spend nothing foolishly. For who, if he saw that you were quite frugal in your expenditures for the commonwealth, would not willingly contribute, believing that your wealth meant his own security and prosperity? That's chapter 29, Cassius Dio's book 52. Now, who is the you in this? Well, again, this is a debate between Agrippa and Maecenas in front of Augustus. So they're speaking to the emperor. Now for Cassius Dio, really the you is Severus Alexander and any subsequent emperors that would heed his warning. So what is he saying here? He suggests that if provincials in the Roman Empire see that their taxes are used for their own security, for their benefit, if they see that the taxes they pay are redistributed back to them through good government, then they are far less likely to rebel. In fact, they might see their taxes not as an imposition or an abuse, but as an investment in their own communities. And of course, it will help, as Cassius Dio says, if the emperor is frugal and if he himself lives as a kind of example of moderate and temperate living and not wasteful spending. Here again, I think Cassius Dio offers good advice to the emperors of his day. Commodus, for example, was wasteful and excessive. So too was Caracalla and Elagabalus. What provincial would want to pay taxes to an emperor who uses that money to build temples for a giant black rock? What provincial wants to pay taxes to an emperor who doesn't provide basic security in that province? And of course, if emperors don't waste a bunch of money on frivolities, then they don't have to take that much money in taxes, which also will make provincials satisfied. And it's interesting here too, because Cassius Dio is not really speaking of provincials as a resource to exploit. He sees them as part of a broader imperial commonwealth, and they ought to be respected and treated with dignity. That's really what he's advocating. And it seems a sensible solution. As we'll see in the crisis of the 3rd century, the provinces would be a major source of revolt. Provincials would be subject to abuses. And essentially, what will have to happen is emperors will have to reconquer large parts of the Roman Empire. Now, that's not good. And had Cassius Dio's advice been heeded, maybe the outcome would have been different. Right after talking about provincials and taxes, Cassius Dio turns to life in the cities of the Roman Empire. And he speaks to how civic life can be encouraged without unnecessary waste. Quote, "The cities should not indulge in public buildings that are unnecessarily numerous or large, nor waste their resources on expenditures for a large number and variety of public games, lest they exhaust themselves in futile exertions and be led by unreasonable rivalries to quarrel among themselves. They ought indeed to have their festivals and spectacles, but not to such an extent that the public treasury or the estates of private citizens should be ruined, or that any stranger who lives there would be compelled to contribute to their expense, or that the maintenance for life should be granted to every one without exception who has won a victory in a contest, for it's unreasonable that the well-to-do should be put under compulsion to spend their money outside of their own countries. I would altogether forbid the holding of races anywhere else than here in Rome. As to the other games, they should be kept within bounds, in order that each community, by putting up an inexpensive basis for entertainments, both for eye and ear, might live with greater moderation and less strife." That's chapter 30 of book 52 of Cassius Dio. I think the message here is pretty clear. Excessive public spending on buildings and games could lead to financial ruin in each city. If something is not done about wasteful, excessive spending, the cities, by competing with each other, and factions within cities by competing with each other, are going to ruin themselves. Instead, financial health and social harmony should be prioritized. Of course, cities can hold games. Of course, they should hold festivals. They ought to. But they should do so in moderation. And the big, expensive events can be held in Rome. Well, in this same part of the book, Cassius Dio then makes a small note about money. This is a very interesting one. It's just one sentence. Quote, "None of the cities should be allowed to have its own separate coinage or system of weights and measures. They should all be required to use ours." This is another one of those parts of the speech that really marks it as contemporary to Cassius Dio's day and not at all based on the actual problems of the age of Augustus, so many years before Cassius Dio was even born. Under Augustus and many emperors afterwards, provincial money systems were left alone. The Romans did not impose their coinage uniformly in the Roman Empire. In Greek cities with Greek coins, they let those circulate. There were different weights and measures all across the empire. The Romans, of course, had conversion rates between different coinages and different measures, but they did not impose their own standards, largely for practical reasons. The Romans really just wanted to skim wealth off the top of their provinces, especially during the days of the Pax Romana. They really weren't interested in ruling the minutiae of cities and making various cities in their empire adopt to Roman culture. The fact is, the system worked just fine without Romanization, and the Romans didn't want to jeopardize the cash flow, and they didn't want to jeopardize order, and so they did not impose, say, currency standards across the empire. What Cassius Dio is saying is the Romans ought to. Now, this would prove prophetic. The fact is, even during Cassius Dio's day, and especially in the decades after, the Romans would impose their currency throughout the empire, such that within 100 years of Cassius Dio writing this, there are really no provincial coinages left in the empire. Now, on the one hand, that simplified transactions in the empire. It was very easy to tell how much something was in any part of the empire. One did not have to do money changing fees or any of those other inconveniences and pay for the transaction costs involved in all of that. That, of course, was very useful, and no doubt Cassius Dio is thinking about that when he gives this advice. He's also probably thinking about identity. If these cities are really part of a commonwealth led by Rome, then the persistence of provincial coinages send the wrong message. These are Roman cities. Their identity is Roman, even if they're culturally Greek, and so they need to use Roman money. The problem with Cassius Dio's suggestion, however, is that local culture is very difficult to eradicate without some kind of extreme force, and people resent it. Even today, in the same part of the world, despite decades of economic and political coordination and even centralization, the local identities in Europe persist and are deeply meaningful for many of those peoples in those countries, much more so in the ancient world. And you might say, well, it's just money. But coinage was a mark of autonomy in the ancient world. It was important for city-states to continue to mint their own coins, even when they were ruled by Rome, as a way of making it clear that Rome was not trying to erase their identity, that Rome was benevolent. It was an administrative master, for sure, but it wasn't an eradicating force. If your existence isn't threatened, you're far more willing to cooperate with an imperial power. Cassius Dio probably didn't realize, or maybe he didn't care, that this advice, which was followed, was one of several sources of problems in the decades and the centuries to come. All right, fourthly, I wanted to look at what Cassius Dio says about the role of the Senate and justice in the Roman Empire. Introduce before the Senate the embassies which come from the enemy and from those under treaty with us, whether kings or democracies. Have all your legislation enacted by the Senate, and to enforce no measure whatever upon all people alike except the decrees of this body. It would be well in the case of the members of the Senate, their children and their wives, if ever they're charged with a serious offense for which the penalty on conviction would be disenfranchisement, exile, or even death, that you should bring the matter before the Senate without prejudgment against the accused, and should commit to that body the entire decision uninfluenced by your opinion. The purpose of this is that the guilty, thus tried by a jury consisting solely of their peers, may be punished without there being any resentment against you, and that the others, seeing this, may mend their ways through fear of being publicly pilloried themselves. That's chapter 31 in book 52. This, I think, is one of the most aristocratic, friendly arguments in this speech. Cassius Dio, a Roman senator himself, clearly favors a strong and active Senate, one which has a say in foreign policy, especially diplomacy. Emperors, of course, are commanders of the soldiers, and they will lead in wars, but the Senate can lead in diplomacy. They will also be a judicial Supreme Court to try their own members. He suggests a policy not unlike that of Marcus Aurelius, allowing the Senate to police itself. He suggests that emperors not try to influence the outcome of such trials either. This is good for justice. It's also good for the emperor, because if the emperor doesn't involve himself, he can't be resented by the people that are found guilty and punished. Now, this is, I think, a sensible reform. However, I'm not sure how much good it would have done at the time. As we'll see in the crisis of the 3rd century, the power of the military is so strong that giving the senators control over other senators in this way probably isn't going to do much. The real power was in the military, not in the Senate. Having senators do diplomacy, on the other hand, might have helped, especially when combined with Cassius Dio's first suggestion of having a standing army defend the borders. It makes sense. The emperor, who is in charge of the border provinces, can keep the peace and defend Rome, while the senators, who, like Cassius Dio, are well trained in rhetoric, philosophy, history, diplomacy, will be excellent ambassadors of the Roman Empire to those both outside and within. Allowing the Senate to handle that aspect of foreign policy would free up the emperor to perform his role. And while by this time senators were not really a threat to revolt, it is best not to make enemies of rich and powerful people, and so the emperor, by staying out of senatorial politics, would ensure that conspiracies and plots wouldn't originate from that body. And that, I think, matters. Finally, there is the question of religion. By Cassius Dio's day, imperial cult was arguably out of control. Cassius Dio must have thought what happened with Elagabalus was outright insane. He also saw the excesses of Commodus, who thought that he was the reincarnation of Hercules and named everything after him, including months of the year, the city of Rome itself, the soldiers, and a few other things for good measure, although not toilets, despite the fact that we call toilets commodes. Not actually sure why we do that. So as for emperor worship, Cassius Dio advocates some pretty serious reforms, at least compared to what had happened recently. This is what he says, quote, "Never permit gold or silver images of yourself to be made, for they are not only costly, but also invite destruction and last only a brief time. But rather, by your benefactions, fashion other images in the hearts of your people, images which will never tarnish or perish. Neither should you ever permit the raising of a temple to you, for the expenditure of vast sums of money on such objects is sheer waste. This money would be better used for necessary objects, for wealth which is really wealth is gathered, not so much by getting largely as by saving largely. Then again, from temples comes no enhancement of one's glory, for it is virtue that raises many men to the level of gods, and no man ever became a god by popular vote. Hence, if you are upright as a man and honorable as a ruler, the whole earth will be your hallowed precinct, all cities your temples, and all men your statues, since within their thoughts you will ever be enshrined and glorified. If you desire to become in very truth immortal, act as I advise." That's chapter 35 of Cassius Dio's book 52. This is really the last excerpt that I want to look at. This is already getting a little bit long. Here he advises against allowing gold and silver statues and temples in honor of the emperor. This is obviously very moderate. It goes back to Augustus himself, who did not permit a temple to himself to be built. And the philosophical argument here is a very profound one. Basically, it's much better to have a reputation for good virtue and good character. And this reputation will live on not only in the minds of the people who you rule over in the present, but it will last throughout time. And of course, Cassius Dio is kind of proving his point by example. He himself is writing about Augustus, who died over 200 years prior to this, and yet he was still remembered, and remembered as a good emperor. And he did not insist on the kind of worship that more recent emperors had. Real honor, according to Cassius Dio, comes from goodwill and wisdom and benefiting the public. This, of course, seems like very reasonable advice to me based on the context of the period. Unfortunately, as Rome was accelerating towards crisis after the Pax Romana, emperors felt the need to pursue legitimacy as quickly as possible, and that meant grandiosity. It meant building temples, building statues, claiming to be divine, because these emperors were competing with other potential emperors. And so there seemed to be a pressing, expedient need for some kind of edge in the propaganda wars that were being fought alongside of the real civil wars. And by this, I'm just saying I'm not sure how much Cassius Dio's advice could have been followed. The fact is, in a period of civil war like that which occurred in the 3rd century AD, an emperor who did not appeal to some kind of divine legitimacy likely would have been outcompeted by those who did. This advice is really more appropriate in a stable Roman Empire. And interestingly, as we know from the last episode, Severus Alexander may very well have taken Cassius Dio's advice on this point, and it didn't end well for him. The unfortunate reality is, all people are often looking for objects of worship. Freedom may sound good in the abstract. In reality, it's very scary, and it seems safer to have somebody who will just tell you what to do, even better if that person is sanctioned by the gods or maybe is himself a god. Such divinity allows people to cede their rational thought, their questioning, their concerns, their skepticism to some vague divine force as defined in an emperor or a king or some other sovereign. And Rome's emperors knew this, and they exploited it for their benefit, both before Cassius Dio lived, during, and then especially afterwards. In fact, as we'll see in our discussion of the crisis of the 3rd century, there are some major religious changes. Elagabalus, in his attempt to make everyone in the empire worship the sun god, it was a forerunner of even larger changes to come. Cassius Dio did not live to see those days. He died in AD 235. And as we'll see in subsequent episodes of the podcast, so too did any semblance of senatorial influence. The fact is, the Pax Romana was over. The transition period of the Severans was also gone. Now began the age of violence and chaos.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.